It may seem hard to believe, but at one point, Mickey Mouse actually had a personality. The 1930s comics by Floyd Gottfredson did more to establish Mickey as a feisty adventurer, a loudmouth, than many of his animated shorts. These comic strips came out just 2 years after Steamboat Willie, which, as we all know, just entered the public domain. So let's talk about a time when Mickey was cool, the Mickey Mouse comics. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. In 1928, Steamboat Willie debuted. That was an animated short featuring Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse. It was animated by UB Iwerks and Walt Disney, and now, well, it just entered the public domain. Now, let's be clear. The only thing that's entered the public domain is the interpretation of Mickey and Minnie that you see in that specific animated short. None of the other elements from Mickey Mouse that came later. And, by the way, Disney has an active trademark on Mickey, so be very careful on how you use it if you decide to go that route. But that got me thinking, who even is Mickey Mouse? If you look at those early animated shorts, how would you define his personality? He's generically nice. He's got a high-pitched falsetto voice. I don't know what else you'd have to say. But then you look at the comic books that he was appearing in, starting in 1930, and all of a sudden, he's so dynamic. You know, he's sarcastic, and he has quips and burns for his enemies. He's always getting into fights and battles and going to faraway, exotic places. It's amazing just how different it is. In 1930, Floyd Gottfredson was the writer and artist on Mickey Mouse comics, and he remained in that role all the way until 1975. So today, I want to tell you about these comics, why they're fun and cool, and who Floyd Gottfredson was. Mickey Mouse's animated shorts were an instant hit, and by the early 1930s, Mickey Mouse was hugely popular worldwide. King Features Syndicate came calling to Walt Disney early on. King Features Syndicate was William Randolph Hearst's division for distributing comic strips to newspapers. This was an enormously popular feature at the time, which led to the creation of comic books. Comic books were initially reprints of the most popular comic strips from newspapers, many of them from the talking animal genre. King Features Syndicate published, among other well-known strips, The Phantom and Popeye over the years. In 1930, they convinced Walt Disney to make a Mickey Mouse comic strip. And since Walt had initially had ideas and dreams of being a newspaper cartoonist, he wrote the first several strips. But who would draw it? That's where we'll talk about Floyd Gottfredson. Floyd was born in 1905 in a small town about 180 miles south of Salt Lake City, Utah. As a youngster, he accidentally shot himself in the arm with a hunting rifle. There was a prolonged recovery period, during which time his mother got him some art supplies to help keep him busy. He was unable to get a regular job as he recovered, but his art skills continued to grow. Floyd also spent this time reading dozens and dozens of young adult novels by Horatio Alger, tales about boys going on rags-to-riches journeys. Gottfredson got his first job working as a movie theater projectionist, where he ultimately encountered all of the early Walt Disney and UB Iwerks cartoons. He began an art correspondence course in 1926. Gottfredson did well, won some contests, and took a risk, moving to Los Angeles in 1928 to try to become a cartoonist. Initially, he had to become a projectionist again, but in 1929, someone in the film industry told Floyd about how Walt Disney was about to hire animators for his own company after losing his animators and character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit to Universal. Floyd got his art in front of the company and was offered a job. Walt had Gottfredson study as an in-betweener in the animation department, but Walt ended up needing to hire a regular comic strip artist shortly after the Mickey comic strip started, and he decided to assign Gottfredson as the artist as of April 1st, 1930. By the middle of May, Floyd also took over as the writer. But the needs of comic strips are much different than that of animation. The early animated shorts rarely had time to develop a story, and certainly not much in the way of character. Mickey's first films were all based on the then-new gimmick of having sound. In Steamboat Willie, that meant Mickey used a bunch of animals to play music, for instance. But the comic strip needed dialogue and, being daily, developed Mickey and his supporting cast by necessity. King Features Syndicate urged Disney to make the strips focus on serialized adventure, like the then-popular strip The Gumps by Sidney Smith. And Floyd Gottfredson sure could do adventure and wisecracks. The Mickey Mouse of the early animated shorts barely said more than a couple words before 1936. The Mickey of the comic strips is sarcastic and quick to insult his enemies. There's more to his dialogue than just exposition, but he can unload plenty of that too. The comic strip version of Mickey gets into adventures. He isn't aggressive, but there's plenty of stories where he's backed into a corner and quick to fight back. Mickey is a man of action in his early years, piloting planes, riding horses, running from cannibals, and shooting guns. He's always shooting guns. He's constantly getting the drop on kidnappers, or gangsters, or spies, or even just shooting his gun to show that his dog Pluto isn't afraid of them. Additionally, Mickey's early supporting cast gets developed. There's the scheming Sylvester Shyster, a lawyer always out to swindle someone in the neighborhood and who has no problem hiring henchmen like Pegleg Pete to be his muscle. Horace Horsecollar is initially Mickey's loyal friend, and Clarabelle Cow is sweet, but also the town gossip and a total chatterbox. Floyd Gottfredson also created some supporting characters along the way, but to be fair, none as memorable as fellow Disney Comics artist Carl Barks created for Donald Duck. Perhaps the most notable would be Mickey's nephews, Ferdy and Morty Fieldmouse. They first appeared in comics on September 18, 1932. Donald Duck's far more popular nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, didn't appear until October 17, 1937, over 5 years later. Floyd created a world for Mickey that was lighthearted and gag-driven, but it was also one that mirrored the world that he lived in. America was fighting its way out of the Depression, and a lot of stories have Mickey hunting for treasure or getting into new short-term jobs like boxing or making a golf course in his backyard. This was also the era of prohibition where alcohol was outlawed, but Mickey does come across a character, Cat Nip, who seems to be brewing moonshine with a very strong proof. The short version is that Mickey Mouse in the comics would go on adventures that would take anywhere from 2 to 6 months. Went on all sorts of different adventures, and it was tremendously popular. For instance, in these reprint books that Fantagraphics publishes, editor David Gerstein has tons of supplemental material, articles by other people, history pieces, all sorts of extra artwork, and they show one example, for instance, where Mickey Mouse Comics got over 20,000 pieces of fan mail for a contest they were running. That's a lot of response from little kids. Also, Mickey was not just popular here in America. Mickey Mouse comic strips were so popular worldwide that there was a point in time where they were the only American import into Italy until the very, very final days of World War II. In 1932, the comic strips were exported to Italy, where they were named Topolino. In 1938, Mussolini's fascist government banned American literature with the exception of the popular Mickey Mouse comics. They were finally banned in February of 1942, but resumed in December of 1945 as the war ended. By 1932, Floyd Gottfredson began using a lot of Mickey's animated shorts as inspiration for expanded adventure stories. For instance, the cartoon Mickey's Melodrama is about Mickey and his friends trying to stage a play version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The comic strip started a story on January 11th of 1932 where these same characters are putting on a play, but they have a reason for it. They're trying to raise funds to benefit an orphanage. Sylvester Shyster and Pegleg Pete end up stealing the funds, which turns into a chase to get the money back. 1933's Blackguard Castle strips are a highlight of the early comic strips for Mickey Mouse. Floyd Gottfredson loosely based it off of the cartoon The Mad Doctor, featuring the villain Dr. Triple X, who is clearly inspired by the 1931 movie Frankenstein. Gottfredson turned Dr. Triple X into 3 villainous scientists named X, Double X, and Triplex. They use a hypno ray to turn Horace Horsecollar into a potential killer, so Mickey is forced to battle his best friend. There are real emotional stakes to the stories. By January of 1933, Mickey began hanging around more often with Dippy Dog, who in 1936 began to be called Goofy. Goofy was less of a friend and more of a completely unreliable companion. In Dippy's first adventure with Mickey, Mickey has to be a detective, but can't count on anything sensible from Dippy. Horace appeared a lot less frequently after the Blackguard Castle strips, which is when Mickey began hanging out with Dippy more often. The addition of Dippy, or Goofy, was an example of how the comic strip told its own stories, but would modify itself to mirror whatever the animation was doing. For instance, in 1938, Mickey's design changed from the pie-shaped eyes to cartoony eyeballs with black irises. Gottfredson brought on various inkers and writers to work with him, but continued to plot the book up through 1943. Bill Walsh was the first writer to take over, and in his first 2 stories, he had Mickey Mouse literally battle the Axis powers. According to the book Disney Comics, The Whole Story by Alberto Beccattini, this irritated Adolf Hitler so much that he forced Mussolini to stop printing Topolino comics. Walsh's era is also noted for a lot of sci-fi types of stories. Sci-fi was a growing genre moving into the 50s. By the middle of 1945, perhaps due to America refocusing its energies on itself and home life in general, the comic strip went to simple gag-a-day type strips. But Walsh returned to the sci-fi stuff in 1947, introducing the humanoid from the future Iga Biva, who became Mickey's main supporting character for the next few years. In mid-1955, King Features Syndicate asked for the strip to focus on daily gags instead of a serialized continuity. Your mileage may vary on how much you enjoy those comic strips. For me, I preferred the adventure stuff in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, although Gottfredson remained on the strip as the artist until his retirement in October of 1975. So here's the thing I have to address. I personally find these comics really enjoyable. The art is consistent, it's energetic, it's dynamic and engaging. The stories are full of action. They're legit funny. I laugh at a bunch of the gags. But it has not all aged perfectly. And I'll give credit to Fantagraphics. In their reprints, they have not edited the artwork. They present it exactly as it was back in the day. And by today's standards, a lot of that stuff just has not aged well. So we're going to get into that, but it's really going to blow your mind, some of this stuff, because some of the stuff Mickey does is just not stuff you would expect Mickey Mouse to be engaged with. For example, there is a stretch of comics where Mickey Mouse tries to, and I'm going to try to be careful not to get demonetized here, Mickey tries to unalive himself. In September of 1930, a storyline begins where a rat named Mr. Slicker tries to steal Minnie away from Mickey. Mickey becomes so dejected that he tries to end things with a gun, jumping off a bridge, inhaling poisonous gas, and more. Fortunately, it does end on a positive note, with Mickey declaring that he was foolish to think like that. But for about a week, kids got the darkest Mickey Mouse stories ever. And of course, there are some caricatures that play on racist tropes. There are several stories where Mickey encounters dark natives that turn out to be cannibals. Every time he goes to Africa is unfortunate. Native Americans are barely able to say more than how. It's unfortunate, but it was very unlikely that it was intentional on Floyd Gottfredson's part to be cruel. He was drawing in what was the style at the time. And many other great artists, including Will Eisner, were known to use that imagery. It was cartoon shorthand. It would not be done today, but the comics are presented as they were here without alterations. So you may not be able to enjoy the strips depending on how you feel about stuff like that. I feel like it's a pretty small portion of these overall comics, and that it was passive racism, which was just using the techniques of the time. I don't think that there was anything cruel or mean-spirited, but again, that's just my take on it. Let's move on to talk about what Floyd Gottfredson did well to make these comics cool. First of all, the stories are engaging and they move fast. That takes some talent, because when you're writing a daily strip, you have limitations. You can't do much to play with the height or the length of a strip. You have to somewhat recap what's happened so far with the first panel. Gottfredson does this in a way that doesn't really slow things down. Every story moves at a good clip. One of the first adventures is Race to Death Valley, and it's fantastic. On top of good pacing, the panel art itself seems to move. There are cartooning tricks with motion lines or beads of sweat leaping off a character, but when I look at it, I can absolutely envision the motion. It definitely reminds me of the animated shorts in the best way possible. Gottfredson also has nice world building and twists and turns that keep the stories moving at a good pace. Mickey's dialogue is legit funny most of the time. For instance, here's Mickey frustrated with a lazy sheriff. The only thing that sheriff uses his head for is to keep his ears apart. Actually got a laugh out of me. Gottfredson's biggest strength is probably the consistent art and the pacing. He isn't quite the same at world building as someone like Carl Barks, who invented all sorts of important characters in the world of Donald Duck, like Uncle Scrooge. But that doesn't mean that the comic strips aren't fun. When the comic strip first started, it was initially drawn by the great Ub Iwerks, the artist who designed Mickey Mouse. And while the strips look great, they pretty much all ended with the characters looking at the reader in the final panel and smiling. It was kind of repetitious. In June of 1930, artist Jack King filled in for Gottfredson for almost 2 weeks. It's certainly energetic, but the penciling is a little rougher and less refined than Gottfredson's fine brush strokes. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but my favorite art is definitely Gottfredson's. If you've ever thought that Mickey Mouse was dull or bland, I definitely don't blame you, but I would point you to the comic strips by Floyd Gottfredson, and thank goodness Fantagraphics has reprinted all of them in these great editions, these great volumes, printed as is, and tons of supplementary material to give you some context for the history and the creators and the creative process. Really, really fantastic. I mean, the first 2 volumes came out in a set that won the Eisner Award for Best Reprints. So that definitely says something, speaks to how well done these volumes are. I love them. I think that they're great. I read through them so fast. What else do I want to say about the Mickey Mouse strips? Just that my favorite era is definitely the 1930s and 1940s strips. I mean, that's 2 solid decades of cool action-adventure strips with comedy, and there were seemingly no limits on what kind of story you could tell. You know, Mickey's going to the Klondike, he's going on pirate ships, he's going to the desert, all sorts of crazy stories. And then there was sci-fi stuff as we moved out of the 40s into the 50s. Really, really interesting. The later strips that become gag-a-day are mostly sort of suburban humor, just stuff happening around town. And it's not bad, it just doesn't interest me as much. But I welcome you to check these strips out and let me know in the comments down below if you have read any Mickey Mouse comics, and if so, what are some of your favorites? I would love to know. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be back very soon, and we're going to be staying in the golden age of comics next time, but with probably the most bizarre golden age hero I've ever come across, and that is absolutely saying something. You guys know I love to find weird stuff from the golden age. There's a good one coming. There's a good one coming. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you real soon, and until that time, keep reading comics. Hey team, thanks so much for watching this episode. I really appreciate it, and a super thanks to all my wonderful patrons and supporters on YouTube. Could not make this show without you, so tell you what, I say hello to everybody, but to you, I'm going to pay you a compliment. You have good taste. That's the compliment this week. I have been wanting to do this for quite a while. Covering comic strips is a little more intensive in terms of the research than comic books, just because there can be so many to go through. There's a lot of history a lot of the time. You know, I'd love to cover as well things like Popeye, Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strips about Donald Duck by Carl Barks, maybe someday Don Rosa. There's a lot in terms of comic strips that are important, because that is what became comic books. The first comic books, they were talking animal stuff. These books were so ridiculously popular. I don't know how much more popular I can really put it into context than talking about that crazy stuff that was happening in Italy, that they were actually still importing Mickey Mouse as the war went on. Just wild to me. But anyway, I love comic strips. I'd also be curious to hear your recommendations. Are there any other important comic strips that you'd like to hear me analyze, discuss, maybe put into a historical context? I'll see you real soon. Take care.